It was one of those evenings where the air felt crisp, and the city lights shimmered like tiny stars on the wet pavement. Washington, D.C., with all its monuments and powerhouses, seemed quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that makes you think, maybe tonight will be uneventful. But for the woman driving home in her sleek sedan, life had other plans. This wasn't just any woman. She was someone who had spent decades climbing ladders most people didn't even know existed. A 4-star general, a title earned not by luck but by years of sacrifice, hard work, and sheer determination. Her career was nothing short of legendary. She'd walked into rooms filled with skeptical eyes and walked out commanding respect. She'd led thousands of soldiers, advised top government officials, and stood shoulder to shoulder with some of the most powerful leaders in the world. And yet here she was behind the wheel of her car, looking forward to a hot cup of tea and a moment of peace after another grueling day. As she approached an intersection, everything changed in an instant. Red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror, blinding against the darkening sky. 2 police cars pulled up quickly, boxing her in from both sides. For a second, she froze, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Had she missed something? Run a light? Made a wrong turn? No, she was sure she hadn't. Still, she pulled over obediently, rolling down her window as the first officer approached. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone sharp and accusatory. His partner lingered nearby, hand resting casually on his holster, watching her every move. The words stung more than they should have because this wasn't new territory for her. As a black woman, she knew how these situations often played out. Even in her uniform, standing tall with medals pinned proudly to her chest, she'd seen the way some people looked at her, like she didn't belong. Tonight, dressed in civilian clothes, sitting in her expensive car, she could feel their suspicion thick in the air. She reached slowly for her documents, keeping her movements deliberate so as not to alarm them. "I'm happy to show you my license," she said calmly, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I want to let you know I didn't run a red light. I was well within the speed limit, too." The officer barely acknowledged what she said. Instead, he leaned closer, peering into her car as if searching for something incriminating. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he snapped, ignoring her explanation entirely. The second officer began circling her vehicle, shining a flashlight through the windows, inspecting every inch of her car like it held secrets. Her heart pounded, though she tried to stay composed. This wasn't about her personally. Not really. It was about the color of her skin, the assumptions people made before they even heard her speak. She'd faced prejudice before, of course. Growing up, she'd been told she wouldn't amount to much. In school, teachers doubted her abilities. Even in the military, there were moments when colleagues questioned whether she deserved her rank. But none of that stopped her. She fought harder, worked longer, proved herself time and again until no one could deny her achievements. But this was different. Here, on this lonely street corner, surrounded by flashing lights and distrustful stares, she felt powerless. All her accomplishments meant nothing to these men. They didn't see a decorated soldier or a leader respected across the globe. They saw a black woman driving a nice car, and somehow, that made her suspicious. One of the officers opened her glove compartment without asking, rifling through papers and personal belongings. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice firmer now. "You don't have the right to go through my things without probable cause." He ignored her completely, pulling out random items, a map, a spare pair of sunglasses, a pen, and tossing them onto the passenger seat. Then, as if realizing she might actually know her rights, he straightened up and glared at her. "Do you have a problem, ma'am?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "No," she replied evenly, meeting his gaze. "But I do expect to be treated fairly under the law." Fairness, however, seemed to be in short supply tonight. Without warning, the officer grabbed her arm and yanked her out of the car. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked around her wrists before she could protest. Pedestrians passing by slowed down to watch, some shaking their heads in disbelief. How could this be happening? To anyone, let alone someone like her. And yet, it was. Standing there on the curb, Hands cuffed behind her back, she felt a mix of emotions swirling inside: anger, frustration, sadness. But above all, she felt determined to survive this moment with dignity, determined to remember who she was and what she represented, and determined to make sure this wouldn't be the end of her story, but rather the beginning of something bigger. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one heavier than the last. Handcuffed and standing on the curb, the woman tried to steady her breathing. The chill in the air bit at her skin, but it wasn't just the cold that made her shiver. It was the weight of the situation, the sheer absurdity of being treated like a criminal when she had done nothing wrong. She replayed the events in her mind: the traffic stop, the accusations, the rough way they handled her. None of it added up. One officer stood nearby, arms crossed, glaring at her as if daring her to say something. The other paced around her car, still searching for, well, she didn't know what. Evidence? A reason to justify their actions? Whatever it was, they weren't finding anything. Her car was clean. No hidden contraband, no suspicious items. Just an ordinary vehicle belonging to someone who happened to be extraordinary. She glanced at her purse, sitting untouched on the passenger seat. Inside was her phone, buzzing incessantly with calls she couldn't answer. She recognized the pattern of the vibrations. It was her work line. Calls from colleagues, maybe even superiors, wondering where she was. Important meetings were scheduled. Decisions needed to be made. And here she was, stuck on the side of the road, unable to explain herself or respond. "Can I at least answer my phone?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "It's work-related. People are trying to reach me," the officer closest to her scoffed, shaking his head. "You're not going anywhere near that phone," he said sharply. "Not until we figure out what's going on here." She bit back a retort, knowing better than to escalate things further. But inside, frustration bubbled over. What exactly were they trying to figure out? That she was guilty of what? Driving while black? It was a phrase she'd heard countless times before, often dismissed as exaggeration by those who hadn't lived it. Yet here she was, living proof that such a thing wasn't just rhetoric, it was reality. As the minutes ticked by, the scene drew more attention. Pedestrians slowed down, some stopping altogether to watch the spectacle unfold. A few muttered, under their breath, clearly unsettled by what they saw. One man shook his head and muttered, "This doesn't look right." Another woman pulled out her phone, recording the interaction discreetly. Even the officers seemed aware of the growing audience, though they did little to acknowledge it. Then came the moment that pushed everything over the edge. One of the officers decided to take things a step further. He opened the trunk of her car without asking, rummaging through its contents. There wasn't much inside: a spare tire, a blanket, a small toolkit. But the act itself felt invasive, unnecessary. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly, despite her best efforts to stay composed. "You have no reason to search my car like this. I haven't broken any laws." The officer ignored her completely, slamming the trunk shut after finding nothing of interest. Instead of backing off, however, he turned his attention back to her. "You need to learn some respect," he snapped, stepping closer. "We're the ones enforcing the law here, not you." Respect. The word hit her like a punch to the gut. Respect was something she'd earned through years of hard work, sleepless nights, and sacrifices most people couldn't imagine. Respect was what she commanded when she walked into a room full of generals, diplomats, or world leaders. And yet, here she was, being lectured about respect by someone who refused to give her the same courtesy. Her mind raced. Should she push back, demand answers? Or should she stay silent, biding her time until someone realized the gravity of the mistake they were making? She chose the latter, knowing that arguing wouldn't help. Instead, she focused on staying present, reminding herself that this wasn't permanent. This humiliation, this injustice, it would pass. And when it did, she vowed to make sure it mattered. By now, the crowd had grown larger. Some onlookers whispered among themselves, others filmed openly, capturing every detail. One woman stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. "What is this?" Why are you treating her like this? She hasn't done anything wrong." The officers bristled at the interruption. "Ma'am, this is none of your business," one of them shot back, his tone icy. "Move along." But the woman didn't move. Neither did several others who joined her. They formed a loose circle around the scene, their presence a quiet form of protest. Though they didn't know her personally, they could see the unfairness playing out in front of them. To them, she wasn't just a random driver. She was a symbol of how easily power could be misused. Back at the Pentagon, concern was mounting. Staff members shuffled nervously through hallways, checking their phones and exchanging worried glances. The meeting she was supposed to attend had already started, but her chair remained empty. Calls to her cell went unanswered, emails unopened. Something was wrong, that much was clear. Finally, someone suggested tracking her location using the GPS embedded in her official phone. Meanwhile, the tension on the street continued to build. The officers seemed increasingly agitated, their movements hurried and erratic. One of them grabbed her arm again, pulling her toward the patrol car parked nearby. "Get in," he ordered, opening the rear door. She hesitated, looking him directly in the eye. "I haven't resisted you once," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I've cooperated fully. So tell me, what am I being arrested for?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. For a brief moment, the officer faltered, his grip loosening slightly. But then he shook it off, pushing her into the back seat and slamming the door shut behind her. As the car's interior lights flickered on, she caught a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of defiance, exhaustion, and resolve. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of her story. In fact, it might only be the beginning. The patrol car felt smaller than it looked from the outside. Sitting in the back seat, hands still cuffed behind her back, she tried to focus on anything but the weight of the moment. The leather seat smelled faintly of cleaning products, and the air inside was stuffy, almost suffocating. Outside, the crowd that had gathered continued to murmur, their voices rising and falling like waves. Some shouted questions at the officers. Others simply stood there filming everything with their phones. She could hear snippets of what they were saying. "This is wrong," one man yelled. A woman chimed in, her voice trembling with anger. "You're harassing an innocent person." The officers ignored them for the most part, though their body language betrayed how uncomfortable the growing attention was making them. One of them kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone, or something, to intervene. Inside the car, her phone buzzed again, vibrating against the seat where her purse lay untouched. Each vibration felt like a missed opportunity, another moment slipping away when things could have been resolved. She wondered who was trying to reach her now. Was it her team? Her superiors? Someone demanding answers about why she wasn't where she was supposed to be? Whoever it was, they wouldn't get through, not while she sat here trapped in this surreal nightmare. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The officers stood near the hood of the patrol car, talking in hushed tones. Every so often, one of them would glance toward her, their expressions unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. She couldn't tell what they were discussing, but it didn't matter. Whatever decision they made next, it wouldn't change the fact that they'd already crossed a line, a big one. Then came the sound that shifted everything, a crackle from the police radio mounted inside the car. At first it was just static, followed by a voice that sounded distant and mechanical. But then the words became clear enough to understand. Unit 42, stand down immediately. Confirm identity of suspect. Repeat, stand down. The two officers froze, exchanging confused looks. One of them reached for the radio, pressing the button to respond. "Dispatch, can you clarify?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Before dispatch could reply, the radio crackled again. This time the voice wasn't filtered through the usual channels. It was crisp, authoritative, and unmistakably urgent. "This is the Pentagon. You are detaining Lieutenant General Angela Hayes. Release her now or face immediate consequences. Silence fell over the scene like a heavy curtain. For a moment, no one moved. The officers stared at each other, their faces pale, eyes wide with disbelief. Then one of them turned slowly toward the patrol car, peering through the window at the woman sitting quietly in the back seat. She met his gaze evenly, her expression calm but piercing. It took several seconds for the reality to sink in. When it did, panic set in. The same officer who had yanked her out of her car earlier now scrambled to open the door, fumbling with the handle. His partner stood frozen, mouth slightly agape, as if unable to process what was happening. Onlookers watched intently, some gasping audibly as the truth dawned on them too. I'm sorry, ma'am, the officer stammered, stepping aside awkwardly. We didn't realize. She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she stepped out of the car slowly, rolling her shoulders to ease the stiffness from being handcuffed for so long. As she straightened up, she exuded a quiet authority that commanded respect, even from the very men who had mistreated her moments before. One of the officers finally managed to unlock the cuffs, muttering apologies under his breath. He avoided eye contact, his hands shaking slightly as he handed them back to his partner. Neither of them dared to look directly at her now. The bravado they'd displayed earlier had vanished completely, replaced by shame and fear. Around them, the crowd erupted into murmurs and cheers. Some clapped while others shouted words of encouragement. "You showed them," one woman called out. Another added, "They messed with the wrong person." Despite the support, she remained focused, her mind racing ahead to what needed to happen next. A senior officer arrived shortly after, summoned by the frantic calls from both dispatch and the Pentagon. He approached cautiously, extending a hand in greeting. "General Hayes, I am so sorry for this misunderstanding," he began, his tone apologetic but professional. "Please allow us to rectify this situation immediately." She nodded curtly, accepting his handshake without hesitation. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady. "But I think it's important we address not just this incident, but the larger issues it highlights." The senior officer nodded solemnly, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. "Of course, ma'am. We'll conduct a full investigation and ensure proper measures are taken." With that, the tension began to ease, at least outwardly. The crowd dispersed slowly, many lingering to watch as she climbed back into her own car. Her phone lit up again the moment she retrieved it, notifications flooding the screen. Missed calls, text messages, emails, all from people wondering where she was and why she hadn't responded. As she drove away from the scene, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on her shoulders. It wasn't just about her personal experience. It was about the countless others who faced similar treatment every day, people whose titles and accomplishments couldn't shield them from prejudice. What had happened tonight wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much deeper problem. Her thoughts drifted to the officers, their initial arrogance followed by their abrupt shift to panic once they realized who she was. Did they truly believe they were justified in treating her the way they did? Would they have acted differently if she hadn't been who she was? Probably not. And that thought, that realization, was perhaps the hardest pill to swallow. By the time she reached home, exhaustion hit her like a tidal wave. She sat in her driveway for a few minutes, staring at the steering wheel, replaying the events in her mind. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, but so did determination. She knew this wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. Tomorrow she would step back into her role as a leader, but tonight she allowed herself to feel everything she'd kept bottled up during those long, tense hours on the side of the road. Tomorrow, she would fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved better than the system currently offered. Tonight, though, she let the silence wrap around her, a small refuge before the storm ahead. The next morning, the story exploded. News outlets picked up the incident almost instantly, fueled by the videos captured by bystanders and shared across social media platforms. By sunrise, hashtags like respect authority, and justice for all were trending nationwide. Clips of the arrest showed the calm demeanor of the woman contrasted sharply with the aggressive behavior of the officers. Viewers couldn't help but feel a mix of outrage and disbelief. How could this happen? To anyone, yes, but to her? Reporters scrambled to piece together the details. Within hours, profiles about her career surfaced online. Her rise through the ranks, her groundbreaking achievements as one of the highest-ranking black women in the U.S. military, her reputation for fairness and leadership. People who had never heard of her before were suddenly learning about her journey, from humble beginnings to becoming a 4-star general. And yet none of that mattered when she was pulled over on that quiet street. Public reaction was swift and fierce. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters holding signs that read, "Rank doesn't protect you, neither should race," and "Accountability now." Others organized virtual campaigns calling for reforms in policing practices and demanding consequences for the officers involved. The incident became a flashpoint, sparking conversations about systemic racism, profiling, and the misuse of power. For the 2 officers at the center of the storm, life unraveled quickly. Both were placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Their names, once unknown, now appeared in headlines alongside accusations of misconduct. Former colleagues came forward, revealing patterns of similar behavior in past incidents. One former partner described how they often targeted drivers based on stereotypes, rarely facing repercussions for their actions. Another recounted a time when complaints against them were brushed aside, dismissed as unfounded. Meanwhile, she remained focused. Though the events of the previous night weighed heavily on her, she refused to let bitterness consume her. Instead, she channeled her energy into action. Early that morning, she held a meeting with trusted advisors to discuss the next steps. They talked strategy, not just for addressing the fallout from the incident, but also for using it as a catalyst for change. Later that day, she addressed the nation during a live press conference. Dressed in her formal uniform, medals gleaming under the bright lights, she stood tall behind a podium adorned with the seal of the Department of Defense. Her presence alone commanded attention, but it was her words that left a lasting impact. "This is not about me," she began, her voice steady and measured. "I am fortunate to have a platform, resources, and support systems that many do not. But what happened to me happens to countless others every single day, and often with far worse outcomes. This is about the systemic issues we must confront as a society if we want to move forward." She spoke candidly about the humiliation she endured, describing the moment she realized the officers saw her not as a decorated soldier or a leader, but simply as a black woman. She acknowledged the privilege her rank afforded her, a privilege that likely spared her from greater harm, but emphasized that no one should have to rely on titles or fame to be treated with basic human dignity. Her message resonated deeply. Social media lit up with reactions ranging from admiration to calls for accountability. Influencers, activists, and even celebrities joined the conversation, amplifying her voice. Politicians, sensing the public's demand for action, began drafting legislation aimed at addressing racial profiling and excessive use of force. Some proposed mandatory training programs for law enforcement officers, while others pushed for independent oversight committees to investigate misconduct claims. But perhaps the most powerful response came from ordinary citizens. Stories poured in from people sharing their own experiences of being profiled, harassed, or mistreated by authorities. A teacher recounted being pulled over repeatedly despite having a spotless driving record. A doctor described being handcuffed in front of his patients after being accused of stealing his own car. Each story added another layer to the narrative, underscoring the pervasive nature of the problem. Amidst the chaos, the 2 officers faced mounting pressure. Their department conducted a thorough review of their conduct, uncovering a troubling history of complaints filed against them. Internal memos revealed warnings from supervisors about their aggressive tactics, yet no meaningful action had been taken. Public outcry grew louder, with petitions circulating to terminate their employment permanently. Legal experts weighed in, debating whether criminal charges could be pursued. While some argued that the officer's actions constituted false imprisonment, others pointed out the difficulty of proving malicious intent. Regardless, the case highlighted the urgent need for clearer guidelines and stricter enforcement of accountability measures within law enforcement agencies. Behind the scenes, she worked tirelessly to ensure the incident didn't fade into obscurity. She collaborated with civil rights organizations, lending her influence to initiatives aimed at dismantling systemic bias. She met with community leaders, listening to their concerns and brainstorming solutions. She even reached out to the families of victims of police brutality, offering her support and vowing to keep their stories alive. Her efforts weren't without challenges. Critics accused her of exploiting the situation for personal gain, though such claims were quickly dismissed by those who knew her character. Allies cautioned her about burnout, urging her to take breaks and prioritize self-care. But she pressed on, driven by a sense of duty to turn pain into progress. As days turned into weeks, the momentum continued to build. Lawmakers introduced bipartisan bills targeting police reform, citing her case as a prime example of why change was necessary. Educators incorporated discussions of the incident into classroom curriculums, encouraging students to think critically about race, power, and justice. Artists created murals and music inspired by her resilience, turning her story into a symbol of hope and defiance. Through it all, she remained grounded. She understood that true transformation wouldn't happen overnight, that it would require sustained effort, uncomfortable conversations, and unwavering commitment. But she also believed in the possibility of a better future, one where no one had to prove their worth to receive respect. And so, she kept moving forward, one step at a time, because for her, this wasn't just about seeking justice for herself. It was about paving the way for generations to come. Months passed, but the ripple effects of that night continued to spread. The incident wasn't just a blip in the news cycle, it became a turning point, a moment etched into the collective memory of a nation. For her, it was both a personal trial and a public reckoning. She carried the weight of what happened with her every day, not as a burden, but as fuel for the work she knew still needed to be done. The two officers involved faced swift consequences. After weeks of investigations, internal reviews confirmed a pattern of misconduct stretching back years. Complaints about racial profiling, excessive force, and unprofessional behavior had piled up, ignored or brushed aside by higher-ups who should have acted sooner. This time, however, there was no escaping accountability. Both officers were fired from the force, their careers ending in disgrace. Legal proceedings followed, though whether they would face criminal charges remained uncertain. What was clear, though, was that their actions had ignited a firestorm of change, one they hadn't anticipated when they pulled over an unsuspecting driver on that quiet street. For her, the aftermath wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about using her platform to push for meaningful reform. She became a voice for those who often went unheard, speaking at rallies, conferences, and community meetings across the country. Her speeches weren't polished sound bites designed to win applause. They were raw, heartfelt appeals for justice. She shared stories sent to her by ordinary people. A mother terrified every time her son left the house. A young woman pulled over repeatedly for no reason other than the color of her skin. A veteran humiliated during a routine traffic stop, despite proudly serving their country. Each story reinforced why this fight mattered so deeply. "I'm here because I can be," she said during one particularly moving address. "But think about everyone who doesn't have a title, a uniform, or a spotlight. Think about the ones whose voices are silenced before they're even heard. We owe it to them to do better." Her advocacy extended beyond words. She partnered with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at addressing systemic racism within law enforcement. One bill focused on creating independent oversight boards to review cases of alleged misconduct. Another mandated de-escalation training for all officers, emphasizing cultural sensitivity and conflict resolution. These proposals faced resistance, of course. There were always those who clung to the status quo, but she stood firm, rallying support from unlikely allies and pushing forward even when progress felt slow. Communities began to take notice. Inspired by her courage, grassroots movements sprang up in cities and towns nationwide. Citizens organized town halls to discuss policing practices, demanding transparency and accountability. Young activists used social media to amplify marginalized voices, sharing stories and organizing protests that drew thousands. Murals appeared on walls, depicting her alongside civil rights icons, a testament to how her experience had become part of a larger narrative of resilience and resistance. Not everyone agreed with her approach. Critics accused her of being too soft, arguing that real change required more radical action. Others claimed she was grandstanding, using her rank to overshadow the struggles of everyday people. But she didn't let the criticism deter her. Instead, she leaned into the discomfort, recognizing that true leadership meant listening to dissenting opinions while staying true to her values. At home, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could be after such a seismic event. Friends and family checked in regularly, offering support and reminding her to rest. Colleagues marveled at her ability to balance her military responsibilities with her activism, though they also worried about the toll it might take on her. Late at night, sitting alone in her study, she sometimes allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The anger, the frustration, the sadness, it all bubbled to the surface, unchecked. But by morning, she was ready again, determined to keep going. One evening, months after the incident, she received an unexpected visitor. An elderly woman knocked on her door, clutching a worn photograph. In it, a young man smiled brightly, his future seemingly limitless. The woman explained that he was her grandson, killed years ago during a routine traffic stop. "I've been waiting for someone like you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Someone who understands what it's like to be treated as less than human. Please don't stop fighting." That visit stayed with her long after the woman left. It reminded her why she couldn't afford to grow complacent, why giving up was never an option. Every speech she gave, every meeting she attended, every policy she helped shape, it was all for moments like that. For the people who believed in her, who looked to her as proof that change was possible. Years later, historians would look back on that night and see it as a pivotal moment in America's ongoing struggle for equality. Textbooks would include her name alongside others who fought tirelessly for justice. Documentaries would retell the story of how a decorated general was mistaken for a criminal, sparking a national conversation about race and power. But for her, none of that mattered as much as the lives touched along the way. In the end, she viewed her journey not as extraordinary but as emblematic of something far greater. She was a symbol of resilience, yes, but more importantly, she was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could emerge, that dignity could triumph over humiliation, and hope could rise from despair, and that no matter how heavy the odds, the fight for justice was always worth it. As she stood on stage at a ceremony honoring civil rights leaders, the audience erupting into applause, she thought back to that cold autumn night, to the flashing lights, the handcuffs, the disbelief of the officers when they realized who she was. It had been a test, she realized now, not just of her character, but of her commitment to the values she'd spent a lifetime defending. And she had passed not by seeking revenge or glory, but by choosing to lead with grace, strength, and unwavering determination. Because ultimately, that's what defined her legacy. Not the rank she held or the accolades she earned, but the belief that even the smallest acts of courage could spark monumental change.